So Nick, heads of terms. This
Yes.
is, some people, some clients, some companies will know what heads of terms are.
Yep.
But for you, succinctly, what's a heads of term?
Heads of terms are a summary of the proposed transaction in which the buyer and the seller set out their view on how the deal should be structured. You're going to talk about price, you're going to talk about how the price is calculated, you might talk about some conditions or requirements before completion can be met. You're going to talk about due diligence, changes in directors, other changes in the company. So it's a sort of summary, few pages summary of how the deal is going to progress. It's useful to look back on if there are later some sort of changes in recollection or changes in view. People can be pulled back to their heads and say, well, look, this is what we anticipated at the outset, what's changed? So yeah, a useful document if done in the right way.
Yeah, well, for me, heads of terms is very simple. To me, it's the deal.
Yeah.
It's the terms of the deal. And I suppose I've seen heads of terms from, literally a single pager.
Yeah.
I agree to buy that for that amount of money. And I think the worst I saw was about 26, 27 pages of, narrative of complete detail. But it is, for me, it is just simply the terms of the deal that says you're going to be selling your business, how much, for how much money, when is it going to happen, what are the conditions attached, and so on.
Yeah.
But it's funny because when I've seen clients do what I call do-it-yourself heads of terms,
Yes.
and I've seen pretty extensive heads of terms drawn up by buyers or buyer solicitors, and I wonder, I do reflect a little bit. For me, it's a really important document because, of course, it is mostly non-binding because, of course, there's usually terms in there, aren't there, that are legally binding terms, and they're usually referred to in the document, but mostly it's a non-binding document.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. You normally have a period of exclusivity in the heads. A seller will grant a buyer a fixed period, might be 2 or 3 months, for the buyer to complete their due diligence and to hopefully get the transaction completed. That gives the buyer certainty to invest the time and the money in that process without knowing or without fearing that the seller is going to go off and sort of sell the business from underneath them to somebody else. So that will be a binding provision in the heads normally. The governing law clause is normally binding, confidentiality, and there might be a few other pieces. But generally, what you say is correct. They're normally a non-binding statement of the party's intent at the time. You mentioned the different types of heads of terms, from the sort of one-page back of a fag packet type heads to the sort of 26, 27 pages. There's a middle ground, and that's what you need to find. We often use an expression, don't do the deal in the heads. And I think that if you're getting up to 25, 26, 27 pages, you've overcooked it a bit, and actually you can lose a lot of deal momentum if you get bogged down in spending weeks negotiating heads of terms. It should be a snapshot, which is fairly easy to capture, and you should be doing that in less than 10 pages really. The danger of the one-page heads, which is often not professionally prepared, is that quite a lot of the detail, are we talking completion counts, are we talking lockbox, a lot of that detail is often not captured. So yeah, the middle ground is where you want to be.
Yeah, it's funny you say that because, of course, I'm thinking about a recent project, a recent, sort of engagement where I think, acting for the sellers, typically the process of getting a deal agreed with a buyer and seller is you agree a price.
Yep.
Or consideration, if you like, in M&A terms, but it's a price. And actually what is less transparent, in my view, and the sellers often fall into this trap, is that they think is that, let's say they're offered 10 million quid for their business. They assume that they're going to sell and they're going to complete, and on the day of completion, 10 million pounds will flow into their bank accounts and off they sail into the sunset. And of course, it
doesn't always work like that, does it? No.
Doesn't always work like that. And inevitably, the buyer will do some due diligence, and I'm sure we'll talk about that later, but they'll do due diligence and they'll inevitably find bits here, there, and it could be small bits, it could be big bits, but they're going to want to retain or have some comfort that they, the warranties and the indemnities that come up later downstream, that they're going to be able to claim on money. And what I'm basically saying is that I think it's quite good to address up front in the heads just that element of that. Well, how much is going to be on the table at the end of this process? Can the buyer commit to a certain value, percentage of the deal? 9 million out of the 10 or 9.5 million out of the 10 million, say.
And the price is often not binding, isn't it? You know, we talked about binding, non-binding. The price is often not binding because, as you say, the buyer at the outset doesn't know what they're going to cover in due diligence. There may be a horrendous piece of litigation. There may be some sort of regulatory problem with a large fine looming. Well, if you've offered £10 million for a business and then you discover in due diligence there's a £1 million claim coming, you're probably not going to honour that £10 million because one of the assumptions, and you might list assumptions in heads of terms, is that there is no material litigation, that all the customer contracts are in place, that all of the IP is valid. So listing assumptions can be a good way to sort of set out how you see the playing field. And then if there are any deviations to those assumptions, then it's an opportunity for the parties to revisit the price and to negotiate the price. The basis for the price might be by reference, as we said, to completion accounts and lockbox. We'll talk about those, I think, in a separate video. But there is a bit there to understand for the seller, certainly the first-time seller who hasn't been through the process before, in terms of understanding what the sort of output is from that number once the various calculations have been completed.
Yeah, and I think if there's one material aspect that I draw upon over the past 10 years to saying, is there one thing that a seller typically doesn't understand, to put it bluntly, and it's that movement, especially if you're doing completion accounts, if it's the movement in working capital in the business from the point you agree the deal to the day the deal actually completes can be 3 to 6 months.
Can be, yeah.
Can be in that period. And the business is moving and the working capital, the balance sheet is moving, and that can have a very material positive or negative impact. And that's, I suppose, where corporate finance, the whole notion of getting a specialist, advisory team comes into helping guide, because of course you can forecast this stuff and work it out.
Absolutely. I mean, it's more your sort of zone than mine, but yes, that fluctuation in business in the intervening period from heads of terms to completion, you might have new customers arriving, you might lose a material customer. There may be all manner of changes in the business which need to be reflected in the price. So yeah, people need to have a good grasp and understanding of that.
I have a question for you, two that come to mind. So we'll use this just as a bit of experience for me as well. So I'm seeing, we still see overseas transactions. In other words, the buyer's based in a geographic domain outside the UK, and they want to strike heads of terms with the seller. So buyers overseas, sellers UK, for example, and the question of which legal jurisdiction. Of course, we'd always argue that it's UK, but what happens, somebody says, listen, we want it to be French, we want it to be German, we want it to be Italian, in other words, where the buyer is based. Do you have a view on that?
Yeah, I mean, typically if the seller and the target business are based in the UK, you've got a very strong argument for saying, well, this contract is going to be performed in the UK, the sale and purchase is of a UK-based entity, and it's a UK-based seller. So I think you've got a strong argument to insist upon that. If the buyer has a stronger bargaining position for whatever reason, and the seller decides to agree to a foreign jurisdiction, you're going to need some advice from that jurisdiction. We're not qualified to offer advice on the application of, Australian law or law applicable in Dubai or the United States. But I mean, the vast majority of deals, and we do a lot of foreign and international transactions, do use UK English and Welsh law because it's a proven body of law. Got good case law here. It's well understood. And in fact, some foreign transactions, which may be based buyer and seller and the target overseas, may still opt to use English law because it is that well-known, body of law.
Yeah. My personal take on it is always try to err towards English law, because I think, we've dealt with international, both you and I have dealt with extensive international, where it's gone as far as Australia, South Africa, Hong Kong.
Yes.
And when I think about those, actually, there's very few legal bodies, and I'm talking about law firms now, that have a genuine pan-global presence that can actually legitimately going, okay, no problem at all, we can advise on Japanese law, Chinese law, or
it's rare to find one firm that can do all of that. I mean, they do exist, I expect, probably at a certain price level, which may not be appropriate for the sort of SME level deals that we're typically doing. It's a case-by-case basis. You've got to look at it and work out what's best for the client, really. But yeah, English law.
Just one more question.
Yeah.
So this is for Mike. Actually, I don't know the answer to this, so I'm asking a question I don't know. We still exist in an era where terms, heads of terms, SBAs are physical ink on paper.
Yeah.
And of course, we can now use, I won't mention it for publicity purposes, but you can use PDF documentation to get digitised signature. Do those stand up in law?
Yeah, we don't see a problem with those. I mean, they are increasingly popular. Those signatures can be checked and verified by IT technology beyond my level of knowledge. But yes, certainly with parties increasingly being remote. Years ago, we used to have physical completion meetings and we'd all trek off to London or Birmingham, wherever, sit round a table and have the completion meeting. That's very rare now. Even in more recent pre-COVID times, completion meetings are typically remote, where the client will come here and sign, or they'll send their signed documents by email and we'll exchange those with the other side. So wet ink signatures will often change hands after the deal, but they're typically not a requirement to actually getting completion done.
Oh, no, thank you. To me, I think, probably one final point. I mean, when I advise sellers, the preparation phase of getting a business ready and going to market often is a discrete piece of work. Typically, that initial piece can involve the lawyers and it can involve accountants and tax advisors, but it's typically a discrete piece where, let's say, a corporate finance M&A firm will do that piece of work. But at the heads period, specifically when you come to that heads, you say, listen, we now have, or we're approaching a deal. In other words, you've introduced the seller to the buyer, there's been the management meetings, they've reviewed the information memorandum and so on and so on, and there's a point at which the deal happens. From my point of view, that's usually the point that I will say to a seller, now we need to engage an M&A lawyer.
Yep.
We need to engage potentially accounting and tax input. Getting that heads square right is absolutely, to me, it's quite an important part of that process. And I think that notion, of course, sellers often try to sort of fall back and say, well, they'll use their local solicitor that did their house conveyancing. And I normally say, no, what's your view on that?
Yeah, I agree with you as to the importance of the heads of terms. And I think in terms of your preparation comment, that's almost, or it should be, a pre-head stage. I mean, ideally, unless you've had some sort of surprise offer arrive on the doormat, most sellers know that they're thinking of selling. And when they're in that process of thinking of selling, there should be a sort of internal audit process where those sellers are checking their contracts, checking their property arrangements, checking their statutory record, checking their employment information, trying to make sure that the company is in an organised and compliant fashion, so that when you sign your heads of terms and the buyer sends you their 50-page due diligence questionnaire, you know that the information you're going to provide is going to be what the buyer's expecting to see. Anything which is not as the buyer is expecting to see is going to be something which is going to have to be solved, and it'll either be solved by going away and fixing it, or by the buyer claiming that it goes to the price and causes a negotiation. So in terms of when to involve the various parties, I think early involvement is sensible. I think that if you have some niggling doubts that perhaps there are a few things in your company or business which are not as tidy or as organised as they could be, speak to your CF advisor or your lawyer about that and work up a list and say, right, we need to achieve A, B and C. Lawyers can help you with that as well. And then on the heads of terms, you get a mix of input. You might need some accountancy or tax input for whatever reason. Probably the CF would take the lead on the heads, but there should be some legal input as well. There are some important legal terms there. So yeah, early involvement would be my message.
Do you think, probably one final point for this heads, is it is a team effort. I mean, if you're selling a decent sized SME, and you dealt with transactions north of £300 million, I think.
Yeah, that's probably our upper end.
Upper end, but it's a sizable amount, right?
Indeed,
I mean, it's in the M, close to an L,
yeah,
an SMLE. We'll invent something new. So, but it's quite a wide range. But if you're dealing with big sums of money, typically, the seller does have a team of advisors.
They will,
CF, M&A lawyer, solicitor or team, accountancy, tax. And my question to you, do you think it's important, because inevitably they are different firms, do you think it's important that team have worked together and have some relationship between them, or is it, in your experience, it doesn't really matter and it's just a transaction and each of those advisors will work? It's a vanilla kind of output, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a benefit to working with fellow advisors who you've worked with before. You know and understand how that party works. ultimately, if the professional advisor is competent and experienced, it shouldn't be a problem who they are or where they're based. I think we gravitate towards people that we know and have worked with before, and often that can bring some efficiencies to the process, and a sort of dovetailed approach, which is important. It is a team effort, it's a group effort. A lot of the issues overlap when you start talking about the share sale and purchase agreement, which have lots of tax content. You're going to need accountancy and tax input on that. So yeah, get the best team you can. If they've worked together before, great. If not, so long as they're all decent and experienced advisors, you should be fine.
Okay, so I think we've covered off heads of terms.